What if one of the most dangerous conflicts in the world was suddenly reduced to a single page? Not a peace treaty, not a summit, not a historic handshake broadcast live to the world. Just one page, 14 points, and a 48-hour window that could decide whether the U.S. Iran war moves toward peace or explodes into something even bigger. Right now, that is exactly the situation global markets, diplomats, oil traders, and military planners are watching. Reports say Washington and Tehran may be closer than ever to a memorandum of understanding that could stop the fighting, reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and restart nuclear negotiations. But just as markets are celebrating, the warnings are still there. Nothing is signed, nothing is guaranteed, and even President Trump is openly saying that if Iran refuses the proposal, the bombing could resume at a much higher intensity. So in this video, we're breaking down what this one-page deal reportedly contains, why oil prices suddenly collapsed, why stock markets surged, what Project Freedom was supposed to do, why it got paused almost immediately, and why this entire moment could either become the beginning of a new Middle East settlement or just the latest false dawn in a war that has already rattled the global economy. Because make no mistake, this isn't just a regional crisis anymore. This is about energy, shipping, inflation, financial markets, and the credibility of American power. The big headline is this. Multiple reports say the United States and Iran are closing in on a one-page memorandum of understanding designed to end the war and create a framework for more detailed negotiations over Iran's nuclear program, sanctions relief, and shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Axios says the White House is expecting Iranian responses on key points within 48 hours. Detroit News, citing sources connected to Pakistani mediation, says the agreement would formally end the war and launch further talks on sanctions, shipping, and nuclear limits. BBC reports this is being seen as the closest both sides have come to an agreement since the conflict began. And the reason this matters so much is because the war has turned one of the world's most important choke points into a geopolitical pressure cooker. The Strait of Hormuz is not some obscure shipping lane. Roughly a fifth of global oil and gas shipments typically pass through that narrow waterway. Since the conflict escalated, Iran has effectively shut the strait to most shipping, and that has sent shockwaves through global energy markets. CNBC described it as part of the biggest energy supply disruption in history, while BBC noted that oil prices, although now falling on hopes of a deal, are still far above the roughly $70 per barrel level seen before the war started. What changed in the last 24 hours? What changed everything was not a signed agreement, but a sudden shift in American military posture. President Trump announced that the U.S. would pause Project Freedom, a military operation launched to escort commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. According to CNBC and BBC, the operation had been introduced as a way to restore shipping flows through the strait. But instead of stabilizing the situation, it appears to have tested the already fragile ceasefire and triggered new escalatory risks. Reports say the move was paused because of what Trump described as great progress in negotiations toward a final agreement. That pause sent an immediate signal to markets. Washington may believe diplomacy has a real chance. And traders reacted fast. Brent crude dropped sharply, at one point falling below $100 a barrel. CNBC reported Brent down around 6% and U.S. crude down nearly 7% early Wednesday, while BBC said Brent fell as low as $97 before rebounding. Oil price described the move as a major sell-off tied directly to hopes that the war may be nearing an end. At the same time, equity markets jumped, with European stocks rising strongly and Asian markets closing higher. In other words, investors saw the headline and instantly priced in de-escalation. But here's where the story gets much more complicated. Even as these peace reports spread, Trump himself was warning that a deal is far from guaranteed. CNBC quoted him saying it would be perhaps a big assumption to think Iran would accept the proposal. And then came the blunt warning. If Iran does not agree, the bombing would resume, and at a much higher level and intensity than before. So the market heard peace may be close, but the political reality is peace may still collapse in real time. That contradiction is at the heart of this entire moment. What is reportedly in the one-page deal? So what exactly is in this reported one-page memorandum? According to Axios, The draft is a 14-point MOU that would declare an end to the war and begin a 30-day negotiation period for a more detailed agreement. During that period, the two sides would work on reopening the strait, limiting Iran's nuclear program, and lifting U.S. sanctions. Axios reports that the U.S. and Iran, through direct contacts and mediators, are discussing a phased arrangement in which both sides would gradually ease their restrictions in and around Hormuz while trying to lock in broader terms. The nuclear portion may be the most sensitive of all. Axios says the core debate is over a moratorium on Iranian uranium enrichment. Iran reportedly proposed a 5-year moratorium, while the U.S. demanded 20 years, and sources say the likely landing zone could be somewhere around 12 to 15 years. The proposed terms reportedly include Iran committing never to pursue a nuclear weapon, accepting enhanced inspections including snap inspections by UN inspectors, and possibly agreeing not to operate underground nuclear facilities. There are also claims that Iran could remove its highly enriched uranium from the country, something that would represent a major concession if confirmed. On the U.S. side, the proposal reportedly includes a gradual lifting of sanctions and the release of billions of dollars in frozen Iranian funds. That's a huge point because sanctions relief is not some side issue for Tehran. It is central to whether Iran can sell any agreement at home. Detroit News also reports that the broader framework under discussion includes releasing frozen Iranian funds, lifting sanctions, and resolving competing blockades around the Strait of Hormuz. So the bargain, at least on paper, looks familiar: nuclear restraint and shipping normalization in exchange for economic relief and an end to active hostilities. Why the deal still looks fragile, but before anyone calls this a breakthrough, there are major red flags. First, none of these terms are finalized. Axios explicitly says nothing has been agreed yet. BBC says the U.S. is waiting for Iranian responses on key points within the next 48 hours. And Detroit News reports that the proposed memorandum may not initially require both sides to settle the hardest issues up front. That means the hot war could stop, while the underlying disputes remain unresolved. In other words, even if the guns go quiet, the crisis architecture could still be intact. Second, there are key American demands that reportedly do not appear clearly in the current outline. Detroit News notes that past U.S. demands involving Iran's missile program and its support for proxy militias in the Middle East were not mentioned in the reported framework. The same report also says the memorandum discussions, as described by sources, do not clearly resolve the issue of Iran's existing stockpile of uranium enriched to near weapons-grade levels, even though Washington had previously demanded that Tehran give it up before the war could end. That's a huge gap, because if the deal postpones the toughest questions instead of solving them, then this may be less a peace agreement and more a timeout. Third, the politics on both sides look messy. Axios says the White House believes the Iranian leadership is internally divided, making consensus harder to achieve. Some U.S. officials are skeptical even an initial deal will be reached. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio's public tone hardly suggests deep trust. He said the U.S. wants a diplomatic solution, but also made highly combative remarks about Iran's leadership, underscoring just how hostile the atmosphere still is. Tehran, meanwhile, has signaled that any peace deal must be fair, and Iranian parliamentary speaker Mohammad Ghalibaf's rhetoric suggests the regime does not believe pressure is all on its side. Why markets reacted so violently? The market reaction tells you just how high the stakes are. Oil does not collapse like this unless traders think the probability of a supply shock is dropping. CNBC cites ING saying a deal that normalizes oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz is crucial. It also notes that roughly 13 million barrels per day of disrupted supply has been cushioned by inventories that are now declining rapidly. That means the world has been surviving this crisis partly by burning through stockpiles. If diplomacy fails and the disruption continues, the market becomes even more vulnerable. And the shipping side of this is staggering. CNBC reports that around 23,000 seafarers across vessels from 87 countries have been stranded in the Persian Gulf after Iran's effective shutdown of the strait. That statistic is one of the clearest reminders that this is not just about energy prices on a screen. These are real ships, real crews, real supply chains, and real bottlenecks. Even if a deal is signed, experts quoted by CNBC warn that normalization in shipping and trade flows would still take weeks and weeks. So markets may celebrate headlines, but the physical world moves much more slowly. Oil price adds another key layer to this. Traders have been through this cycle multiple times already. Hopeful headline: oil falls, details unravel, prices creep back up. According to its reconstruction of the war timeline, the market has repeatedly reacted to ceasefire claims, proposals, and diplomatic rumors, only to be disappointed when talks collapsed or violence resumed. That's why, despite today's dramatic sell-off, there is still a deep undercurrent of skepticism. The market is not just pricing peace. It is pricing the possibility that this peace story could break apart the way previous ones did. How we got here: to understand why this single page carries so much weight, you have to remember how violent and unstable the last 2 months have been. Oil price traces the conflict back to February 28th, when U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran triggered a dramatic escalation, and Iran responded by shutting the Strait of Hormuz. Brent then surged, at one point moving toward $120 and later even higher, as the world confronted the possibility of a prolonged Gulf War colliding with a global energy crunch. Then came a series of half-breakthroughs and breakdowns. BBC notes that on April 8th the U.S. and Iran reached a ceasefire that caused oil to slump and stocks to jump, only for tensions to flare again later. Detroit News says Pakistan hosted the war's only peace talks so far and has continued acting as mediator, ferrying proposals between the sides. Oil price says Islamabad talks later collapsed, and Washington hardened its posture. That history matters because it shows why today's diplomatic optimism is being treated as important, but not yet decisive. And then there was Project Freedom. According to Detroit News and BBC, Trump launched the operation to guide ships through the strait, but it failed to restore normal traffic and instead risked more clashes. Detroit News says the mission had not produced any significant resumption in shipping and may have provoked further Iranian strikes on ships and nearby targets. BBC says the operation tested the ceasefire and became another flashpoint. That helps explain why pausing it was so important. It wasn't just a military adjustment. It was a signal that Washington might be willing to trade coercive pressure for a diplomatic off-ramp, at least temporarily. The geopolitical meaning: strategically, this moment is about much more than whether two governments can agree on a memo. It's about whether the United States can convert military pressure into a controlled diplomatic settlement without looking weak, and whether Iran can secure sanctions relief and survival without appearing to surrender on sovereignty and nuclear rights. Axios reports that one of the key details still under negotiation is how long Iran would suspend enrichment and under what conditions that moratorium might be extended. That is not a technical footnote. It is the political core of the bargain. For Washington, a deal would offer several obvious benefits. It could calm oil markets, reduce inflation pressure, ease stress on allies and global shipping, and create a framework to constrain Iran's nuclear activities. For Trump specifically, it would allow him to claim that force created leverage and diplomacy delivered results. But the risk is also clear. If the agreement is too vague, too soft, or too temporary, critics will say the U.S. used military escalation only to settle for a fragile pause. Detroit News reporting on omitted demands, missiles, proxies, and unresolved enriched stockpiles points directly to that vulnerability. For Iran, the incentives are also obvious. Sanctions relief, access to frozen funds, and the reopening of shipping routes would all provide major economic and strategic relief. But Tehran also has to think about deterrence and domestic legitimacy. Accepting long-term restrictions on enrichment, enhanced inspections, and possible removal of highly enriched uranium would be a major concession. That is why BBC's line that the U.S. is awaiting responses on key points in the next 48 hours is so important. The real question now is not whether diplomats can write terms on paper. It's whether Iran's leadership can politically absorb those terms. What happens next? So what should everyone be watching now? First, Iran's response. CNBC says Tehran is evaluating Washington's proposal and has said any peace deal must be fair. BBC says the U.S. expects an answer on key points within 48 hours. If Iran signals acceptance, even in principle, markets may push oil lower again, and the focus will immediately shift to implementation. How quickly can shipping restart? How gradually are sanctions lifted? And what nuclear commitments are actually verifiable? Second, watch whether the pause in Project Freedom holds. Oil price reports that crude came under pressure after Trump paused the escort effort, but it also notes there have been no concrete steps toward peace yet. That means one military incident in or around the strait could instantly reverse the mood. If ships are struck again, if escorts resume, or if one side accuses the other of violating the ceasefire, the market reaction could be brutal and immediate. Third, watch the details, not just the headline. This is probably the single most important takeaway from all 6 articles. The headline says deal close, but the details say the hardest questions are still open. Enrichment duration, uranium stockpiles, missile issues, proxy activity, the pace of sanctions relief, the mechanics of reopening Hormuz, and what happens if talks collapse during the proposed 30-day negotiation window. Axios even says the arrangement could leave the world in a limbo where the hot war stops, but nothing is fully resolved. That is not peace in the traditional sense. That is conditional de-escalation with a live detonator still attached. And that brings us to the real story behind today's dramatic headlines. The world may be witnessing the start of a diplomatic breakthrough, or just another swing in a war that has already taught markets not to trust first impressions. A one-page memo sounds simple, but behind that page are decades of hostility, competing red lines, nuclear fears, sanctions politics, energy blackmail, and military brinkmanship in one of the most strategic waterways on Earth. If this deal holds, it could mark the first serious step towards stabilizing a crisis that has shaken oil, trade, and geopolitics far beyond the Middle East. If it fails, the next phase may be even more dangerous, because both sides will have tested diplomacy and found it wanting. So for now, the biggest number to watch may not be the oil price, the stock market, or even the number of warships in the Gulf. It may simply be 48 hours. Because somewhere between a paused naval operation, a one-page memorandum, and a handful of still unanswered demands, the next chapter of this conflict is being written. And whether that chapter is called ease, pause, or prelude to a bigger war, we're about to find out.